This is a short video on how Congress fulfills its representative function. You may know from your study of the Constitution that the Great Compromise at the Philadelphia Convention was between two plans for what would happen with the legislature, the New Jersey plan and the Virginia plan. And the debate was whether there would be equal representation of each state in the legislature or representation based on population. And the great compromise of those two plans was to have a bicameral legislature made up of the House of Representatives and the Senate, whereby the Senate would have the equal representation of 2 members per state, and the House of Representatives would have representation based upon population. Remember also that the House of Representatives was the only directly elected chamber at the time of the Constitution being signed, and that the re-election every 2 years was designed to make its members more accountable to the electorate. And therefore it was seen that the House of Representatives would be the one that represented a populist mood compared with the Senate. So in terms of representation, the concept was at the outset of America was that the House of Representatives would do that, perform that function more efficiently than had happened in the Senate. On the next 5 slides, we're going to look at how Congress performs that function today. And of course, a lot has changed in America. The Senate is now directly elected too. And so these 5 functions are going to apply to representatives in both the House and the Senate in modern day America. The first is communicating with your constituents. And one popular mechanism for this in America is the town hall meeting. And ironically, although they're named town hall meetings, they're not usually held in town halls. They may be held in public libraries, public schools, which gives constituents the chance to lobby their representatives or to pass on their thoughts and their views on the issues facing America. And the idea being that representatives take those views on board, they go back to Washington DC with those comments fresh in their mind, and they act in the best interests of their constituents when they get to Washington DC. You can see 2 examples that I've put on there. One is Marjorie Taylor Greene, and in the Shelby group I've put a link to the Marjorie Taylor Greene town hall that she held in West Georgia, in which she came up with some quite controversial remarks. And secondly, we can see that town hall meetings did not stop during the COVID era. Senator Chuck Schumer used Zoom to host a town hall meeting with the LGBT network. And so it just goes to show that members of Congress, both senators and representatives, view town hall meetings as a valuable exercise to get a good idea of what public opinion is in their constituency, whether that be at state or at congressional district level, before they go back to Washington DC and the corridors of power. The next function with which you can represent your constituents is the passage of legislation. And this brings us back to paper 1 with the trustee or Burkean model and the delegate model, which you will have looked at before. And of course, there is a paper 3 synoptic link to Edmund Burke, one of our conservative key thinkers. Now, of course, whenever a member of Congress votes on legislation, they should have their constituents in mind. However, we do live in a time period of hyperpartisanship. And you could actually say that that does represent and reflect American society at the moment, that individuals in Congress who vote with their party do so because society is as divided as it seems. However, it does help to remind ourselves of the delegate and the trustee model. The delegate model being that an individual goes to vote in Congress and is directed by their constituents as to how they should vote on certain matters, whereas the trustee model suggests that we elect representatives and we trust that they will act in our best interests in between election time, and we have the upcoming election to hold them accountable for their decision making at the next election. Third on our list is committee membership. So one way in which you can represent your constituents is by joining a committee which is relevant to your home state or your congressional district. Say hello to Debbie Stabenow, I hope I've pronounced that right, who is a Democrat from the state of Michigan. And Debbie Stabenow is the committee chair of Congress's Agriculture, Nutrition and Forestry Committee. And you can see on the map to the right of Debbie's congressional photograph that her home state of Michigan has a significant amount of forestry. It's a brief Google search tells me that over half of Michigan is forest land. So you can see how members of Congress join a congressional committee which matches their home state or their congressional district as well as their expertise, and that is one way that you can represent the interests of the people that you represent in a different way to simply voting on legislation. You can join or chair a committee that will have an impact on the people of the state or constituency that you stand in. And linked to the last topic on committee membership is lobbying the executive. And this is again another way to try and represent the views of your constituents at national level. And we're talking, of course, here about pork barrelling. Pork barrelling is when, during the process of passing legislation at federal level, funding is outlined for a particular state, region or area. And the term pork barrelling is intended as a criticism. It suggests that members of Congress act selfishly in the interests of their own constituents ahead of the needs of the nation altogether. And it's quite controversial because hundreds of millions of dollars can be spent on these so-called pork barrel projects. So the most famous example is there on the left, which was the Bridge to Nowhere in Alaska. It was a $400 million project. It would have joined a town in Alaska to Gravina Island, which housed about 50 people and a small-scale airport. The bridge, because it's called the Bridge to Nowhere, was never built. Next up, other notable examples, we can see there in 2011, Montana State University was granted $750,000 to use sheep grazing as a means of weed control. And you can see there that the Department of Defense, it says there, contains the most pork. So in 2014, $120 million was allocated for tank upgrades for the US Army that the US Army did not want. And that is because the supplier of the tanks had operations across several congressional districts. So what we can see here is members of Congress outlining funding for upgraded tanks for the US Army, not because it's good for the US Army and it's what the Army wants, but it's good for the district to put money and jobs into the area so that a representative can go back at election time, particularly in the House when you're up for re-election every 2 years, and say, look what I have done for this region, for this area. Okay, finally, constituency casework. And there's a good link here to paper one because this is what MPs and their parliamentary assistants spend a lot of time doing. Casework is when individual constituents go to their representative with an issue that they feel could be best solved with the support of their representative in Congress. And you can see there a 2017 report by the Congressional Research Service said that casework was most frequently required for the following issues: misdirected benefits payments, help with filling out government forms, applying for Social Security, veterans issues, education, federal benefits, explaining government activities or decisions, so people requesting an explanation from their representatives, help with application to a military service academy, and it says there finally, those seeking to apply for US citizenship. This is the day-to-day activity of a representative that they have to do and they have to respond to amongst all of the grand national level voting on legislation, sitting on committees. Because ultimately, this is what your local reputation is staked on. If you garner a reputation as somebody that cares about constituents and responds to constituents and works for them, then you'll be more likely to build that local reputation and retain your seat in Congress, which is what most representatives, especially in the House, where they face frequent re-election every 2 years, that's at the forefront of their mind. How can they improve their reputation to the point where they're staying in their position for as long as they wish to be? Okay, finally, to wrap up, I've spent a lot of this video trying to explain how important representation is and how important it is particularly for members of the House because they want to keep their jobs. Effective representation means that you have happy constituents who rush back to the ballot box to elect you for another term of office. Actually, we're in a strange situation in America where Congress is incredibly unpopular as an institution. In February 2024, Congress's approval rating fell to a record low 12%. That means that 12% of the Americans polled believed that Congress does a good job. So the American public's perception of Congress and what it does for the American people is very low indeed. However, when we look at incumbency success rates, it suggests that individual members of Congress are popular with their constituents. In the 2022 midterms, the congressional incumbency success rate was 98%, which means that just 2% of those incumbent members of Congress who chose to stand for re-election lost. And that figure, 98%, is quite rightly shockingly high. But historically, those numbers seem pretty consistent. It seems that well over 90% of members of Congress retain their seat from one election to the next. In fact, in 41 of 50 states in the 2022 midterms, every member of Congress who was an incumbent was returned. So it suggests that although the public's perception of Congress is very negative, individual members of Congress are popular and being re-elected. However, there is another thing to consider, and that's gerrymandering. And hopefully that's something that you've considered and looked at earlier in the course. Remember that gerrymandering is the deliberate redrawing of congressional district boundaries designed to give one particular political party more of a chance of winning that district at election time. And what that means is that the vast majority of congressional districts are not competitive. And if they're not competitive, incumbents are less likely to lose their seat. And it's not because of their own popularity, but the unpopularity of the other political alternative, which will be the Republican or Democrat candidate, depending on the congressional district that you are in.